Thank you so much to the choir for leading us so beautifully and so powerfully in singing. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long way from home. I've been there, literally a long way from home, surrounded by loss and grief, asking myself, why am I here? And trying to figure out who I was. I told my counselor, I just feel so tired, but I don't know why. I'm getting plenty of sleep. And she encouraged me to pay attention to my body. The feeling of being deeply tired was a sign of something. It was a sign of lostness. Being and feeling lost has a physical effect on our bodies. Her loving encouragement to pay attention was a wake-up call to me. I decided I needed to return home, literally and figuratively, to find myself, to find my grounding, to find a new direction. Sometimes the feeling of being lost takes the form of deep despair, like in the life of Rebecca Parker, whose words were our reading. Parker sought in the lake's cold darkness the consolation that she could not find within herself. But as she made her way toward the lake, she encountered a surprising expression of care. She was met, as she says, right in the center of the pathway of her despair by 100 people who wouldn't let her go that way. I was saved, she said, by one particular human being who assumed I had a desire to see the stars. In a world where people get up in the middle of the night to look at the stars, I could not end my life, she said. In a moment of despair and isolation, an enthusiast in tennis shoes extended a friendly gesture, reconnecting Parker with herself and with the astounding beauty of creation that wouldn't let her go. Being spiritually lost is not altogether different from being physically lost. Being physically lost is a rare occurrence these days in the era of GPS and smartphones. The last time I remember feeling completely and utterly lost on the road was on a trip here to Texas shortly before I moved here. I was visiting my wife Erin in Fort Worth and drove up to Denton one day to meet a ministerial colleague. And as we did in those days, I had printed out directions to and from my destination from the MapQuest website. Somehow, on the drive back home, I got lost. My surroundings were becoming more and more rural, more fields than fast food, and I knew that that wasn't right. I didn't know where I was, how I'd gotten there, or how to get back on track. My MapQuest directions were useless. I had a moment of panic. If I didn't even know where I was, how on earth was I going to figure out how to get back to the highway? So what did I do? I followed the advice that we gave the children earlier. Stop, breathe, and find someone you can trust to help. I stopped on the side of the road, took a deep breath, and called my mom. She was sitting at her desk all the way in Albany, New York. I told her I was lost in Denton, Texas, and asked her to get on her computer and look up directions. I was able to give her the nearest side road, and from that we determined where on earth I was and how to find my way home. I've been lost, and I know that many of you have too. Lost in the wilderness of life with no map to guide us, grieving after the unexpected loss of something or someone dear to you, disoriented due to the loss of faith or belief that brought meaning to your life, even alienated from yourself, having lost touch with who you are. For the British poet David Whyte, this is the very point where deep physical memories are our lifeline to any future we want for ourselves, he says. In effect, somewhere inside us, the child is still running enthusiastically toward a horizon it once glimpsed. Our future lives depend on finding this original directional movement in our lives. Whyte knows firsthand what it's like to lose track of this original directional movement. At middle age, he had made his home in an office building. Busyness was his unknowing way of covering up for the fact that he was not following his passion. Poetry and the life of a poet was calling to him, but he couldn't bring himself to take the leap, so he tried to ignore the pull. Then, he says, one morning, hurtling from my desk toward the photocopier, I passed a room full of my colleagues just about to start a meeting. There was someone I needed to talk to. I saw immediately that he wasn't among them, but I put my head in the door before they could begin, and in a very loud, urgent voice, I said, "Has anyone seen David?" His colleagues were stunned into silence and then started laughing hysterically and pounding the table. I looked back at them blankly, the truth dawning as I looked, he said. David White was the only David who worked under that roof. In the humiliation of that moment, caught forever in a doorway, calling my own name, he says, I saw I had become a stranger to myself. I obviously had a violent need to find myself and give myself a good talking to. Everyone else in the office had discovered that at exactly the same moment I had. He was looking for David because his inner relationship with himself had been neglected. Humiliation is something we usually try to avoid. But as its root word, humus, meaning soil or ground, suggests, humiliation returns us to the ground of our being. Just like the wake-up call that began my journey from being tired to finding my way, White's humiliation was a wake-up call that reoriented him toward that horizon he once glimpsed and ran toward. This experience of being lost and found can happen to entire communities as well. I think of the story of Moses and the Israelites in the Bible. He leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and through the desert wilderness with their sights always set on the promised land, the place of being found. Moses was orphaned as a child, a motherless child, when his mother left him in a basket on the Nile River in hopes of saving him from the Pharaoh's slaughter of all newborn Israelites. He was found by the Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, and raised as a prince. But Moses could not sit silently by while his people were being mistreated. One day he witnessed an Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian guard, so he killed the Egyptian guard and had to flee. He spent the next 40 years as a shepherd until God appeared to him in a burning bush and called him to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt. After weathering several plagues sent by God, Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go. After narrowly escaping the armies Pharaoh had sent to pursue them, the Israelites traveled through the desert for 40 years, which was literally a lifetime in that time and place. They faced illness, hunger, and death, and at one point cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But it was on this journey that God appeared at Mount Sinai, established a covenant with Moses, named the Israelites his people, and gave them the 10 Commandments. It was on this journey through the wilderness that the Israelites learned how to be a people together. As they traveled in the wilderness, they needed a place to worship. They needed, as Unitarian Universalist minister Chris Weiss calls it, a spiritual mobile home. So Moses told the Israelites to gather up gold, silver, and bronze, blue, red, and purple yarn, fine linens, goat hair, leather, wood, oil, and spices. And they used these gifts to construct a sanctuary, a temple, a house to worship their God in the desert. Moses taught the Israelites that the promised land toward which they traveled was actually something that they carried with them. They felt lost and saw the promised land as the place of being found and free, but they were carrying this in their mind and heart the whole time. It was that horizon toward which they ran as a child and toward which they reoriented themselves as adults that dwelled within throughout their journey into and out of slavery. Moses died before the Israelites reached the promised land, but he was a leader and a caregiver to his people and helped them find themselves and their community identity in a very scary time. Moses helped the Israelites reconnect with their God. For them and for many of us, God is a word for that feeling of being cared for, being held, and being part of life itself. This feeling of love and care is what Rebecca Parker experienced as she made her way to the shore of Lake Union to end her life, but was intercepted by an enthusiastic astronomer who invited her to marvel at the stars. She had lost her connection to self, to others, and to God in the depths of her despair, but was invited to reconnect and experience herself as part of something larger. Barbara Brown Taylor, an Episcopal priest, wrote in a chapter on the practice of getting lost, "When the safety net has split, when the resources are gone, when the way ahead is not clear, the sudden exposure can be both frightening and revealing. You told yourself you would die if you ever came to this, but here you are. You cannot help yourself, and yet you live." That makes me think, you cannot help yourself, therefore you must accept the care of others. You must settle into your place in this interdependent web of life. Our collection today is for the North Texas Food Bank, and I imagine that some who find themselves going to the food bank for assistance are saying to themselves something like Taylor said, "I thought I would die if it ever came to this, but here I am." When our basic human need for food is met, we're better able to navigate the emotional and spiritual lostness of our lives. And so the services of the food bank are an expression of care that help people at lost times in their life to find their way. Church, too, is a place that we go to find our way and to feel ourselves held by and connected to something larger than our one individual self. We go to church to rekindle that connection with ourselves, with others, with God, and with all of life. I've seen many of you arrive here, deep in grief, or seeking religious community that will welcome all of who you are, or grasping for direction in a very disorienting time in history, or yearning for opportunities to do good, to love others, and to feel that love in return, or at a turning point in your life, on the verge of something new, hoping to discern and to discover here what is next for you. The kind of care that we experience here enables us to move from lost to found, and it nurtures in us the capacity to love and care for others. We come here to pause and to breathe before we reach the point of bursting into a conference room with great urgency saying, "Has anyone seen Beth?" Pause, breathe, and when you leave this sanctuary in a few minutes, seek out that person you can trust, or be that person another can trust. Give and receive care. Feel the experience of being held by a community of love right here and now. We carry this out of the sanctuary with us into small groups, onto the playground, into the fellowship hall and the parlor, and to lunch or coffee with friends old or new. I know that each time I return to my faith community, it's an experience of returning to and becoming myself, because it orients me toward what is most important. In her poem, "Now I Become Myself," May Sarton reflects on this experience, which for her happens through the practice of writing and sharing poetry. She writes this: "Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces, run madly as if time were there, terribly old, crying a warning. Hurry, you will be dead before..." What? Before you reach the morning, or the end of the poem is clear, or love safe in a walled city? Now to stand still, to be here, feel my own weight and density. The black shadow on the paper is my hand. The shadow of a word, as thought shapes the shaper, falls heavy on the page, is heard. All fuses now fall into place, from wish to action, word to silence. My work, my love, my time, my face gathered into one intense gesture of growing like a plant. As slowly as the ripening fruit, fertile, detached, and always spent, falls but does not exhaust the root, so all the poem is, can give, grows in me to become the song, made so and rooted by love. Now there is time, and time is young. Oh, in this single hour I live all of myself and do not move. I, the pursued, who madly ran, stand still, and stop the sun. I love Sarton's line, oh, in this single hour I live all of myself. Whether you arrived at church today feeling lost or feeling found, here in this hour we welcome you home. Let this be a place where you live all of yourself, reconnect with all of who you are, and find your way through this journey that is life. Amen.